All right, before we look at today's work, it's not going to be too hard. Today's work is not going to be too hard. However, before we look at today's work, let me break down what we call the unit circle. I'm going to be looking at cosine. I'm going to call it theta. And I'm also going to be looking at sine. I'll be looking at cosine and sine. And I'm going to create a table. Now, the important degrees, the special degrees that we have, I remembered in geometry, we deal with the 0 degree because it's very important. But in geometry, you guys dealt with something called the special right triangles. Remember, you guys dealt with the 45, 45, 90 and the 30, 60, 90. Those angles that I just mentioned are very important. So the 30 degrees, the 45 degrees, the 60 degrees, and obviously the 90 degrees. Remember, you guys dealt with 45, 45, 90, the 30, 60, 90. That's where these angles come from. That's if you're looking at this in degrees. Some of you guys might be dealing with this in radians. So for radians, we're 0 degrees is zero. Remember how I said that a whole circle, a couple of lectures before, I said that the whole circle is 2 pi. So remember, the whole circle is 2 pi. That means 180 degrees is 1 pi. Now think of 30. Isn't that 180 divided by 6? Right, 180 divided by 6 is 30. So in radians, I'm going to call this pi over 6. Now 45, I'm going to call this pi over 4. Isn't 180 divided by 4? Give me 45. Now for 60 degrees in radians is pi over 3. Once again, 180 degrees is 1 pi. So I'm thinking 180. Now for 90 degrees, I'm easily going to call that pi over 2. So if you're dealing with degrees, I'm dealing with 0, 30, 45, 60, 90. If you're dealing with radians, 0, pi over 6, pi over 4, pi over 3, pi over 2. Okay, now how am I going to do this? All of this are going to be fractions, all over 2. I want to help you guys be able to produce this real quick. All of these are fractions over 2. On top of it, I have a square root. So let me do a square root on all of these. Now for cosine, I'm just going to start with square root of 4. So inside the square root, I'm going to put a 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. For sine, I'm going to start with 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay, so now cosine, simplify it each if possible. Cosine, isn't the square root of 4 2? So I'm looking at this fraction as 2 over 2. Isn't that just 1? For 30 degrees, I cannot simplify that. So I get this is square root of 3 over 2. Right, I cannot simplify that. This other one, square root of 2 over 2, I can't simplify that. Now, square root of 1, isn't square root of 1 equal to 1? So I'm going to simplify this as 1/2. The square root of 0, isn't that 0? 0 over 2, isn't that 0? So can I just say that for sine, here, the simplified version, I get 0, 1/2, radical 2 over 2, radical 3 over 2, and then 1. Now, to help you guys complete this, I'm just going to say that in your circle, your cosine is going to be your x value, your coordinates of each point. We're going to call this the unit circle. So the length from the origin to the coordinate, if I was to make that the distance is 1, so we're going to call unit circle. You're going to get a little more detailed math analysis on this. But my cosine is going to represent my x value. my sine is going to represent my y value. You guys ever forget which one goes where, cosine or sine? Notice how I put cosine and sine, I put them in alphabetical order. Cosine comes first. X and y, I put them in alphabetical order. X comes first. So that's going to help you remember, is X cosine or is X sine? Now put them in alphabetical order and you will know X is cosine, Y is sine. All right, so once again, let's remember our values here. For cosine, I'm just looking at the abbreviated values. Okay, so why am I saying let's remember those? Math analysis, later on, you guys are going to get something like this. And you guys are going to be asked, simplify. Notice how I'm giving you guys the measurement either degrees or radians. Degrees or radians. Okay, so I already simplified that the first one is 1, 0. Cosine is 1, sine is 0. Now, what about for 30 degrees? I'm just going to say my cosine is radical 3 over 2, and my sine is 1/2. At 45 degrees, or pi over 4, I had radical 2 over 2 for each. For pi over 3, or 60 degrees, I had 1/2 for cosine, and I had radical 3 over 2 for sine. And then for 90 degrees, I got 0, 1. I'm able to complete the first quadrant of the whole circle. Now, how about these? These 2 points. Notice how they have the same height. If I was to measure the height from the y-axis, isn't that the same height? So I'm gonna say the y values on the first quadrant and the second quadrant are going to be the same. So that's radical 3 over 2. This is radical 2 over 2. This is 1/2. The y values is the same. Now, what if I was to compare the distance on the x? Notice for the first quadrant, from my point, if I was to reflect it on the x-axis, I get 1/2. But what about the second point? I get it reflected on the negative side. So my x values for this side is going to be negative 1/2, negative radical 2 over 2, negative radical 3 over 2. Notice how I can easily complete the other side. One of you guys' tests in math analysis will be complete this unit circle. Now, what about the third quadrant? This point with this point. They have the same x value, because notice from the origin, I went to the left. So my points on the second quadrant and the third quadrant are going to have the same x values. So this is going to be negative radical 3 over 2. It's going to be negative radical 2 over 2. It's going to be negative 1/2. Now my y values. If I was my y values on my my second quadrant from the y values, I went up. It makes sense that my y values are positive. On the third quadrant, from the origin, I go down. So my y values are going to be negative. This is going to be negative 1/2, negative radical 2 over 2, and negative radical 3 over 2. I'm not going to complete the four quadrant. I have a picture where I have all of these completed. Part of your homework on next year, when you guys are dealing with math analysis, you don't have the degrees. You will be even asked, find the degrees. Keep in mind, my numbers are my key numbers here are 30, 45, 60. And then here I have a 90. So I ask myself, how much is 90 plus 30? Boom, I get my degrees. How much is 90 plus 45? Boom, I get that answer. How much is 90 plus 60? How much is 90 plus 90? And then I go here. How much is, for these other numbers, let me cancel them out. How much is 180 plus 30? How much is 180 plus 45? How much is 180 plus 60? So it's easy to get my degrees. Once again, the fourth quadrant, I'm not going to complete it. Now, if you're dealing with this in radians, if you know that degrees is easy, how much is 180 over 120? Or you can say, well, don't I have to go pi over 2 plus pi over 6? So I'm thinking pi over 2 plus pi over 6. I know I have to have common denominators. So pi over 2, can I just call that as 3 pi over 6? So when I add this, it gives me 4 pi over 6. 4 pi over 6, isn't that 2 pi over 3? Now for this other one, I have to go pi over 2 plus pi over 4. So I have like 2 pi over 4 because I must have common denominator. Doesn't that give me 3 pi over 4? So it's easy to do this. Now, once again, I said I had a picture with all of these completed. So there's my 4 quadrants. Now, there is a formula we're going to learn today. I'm going to be using 2 things. I'm going to be using the formulas I'm going to give you guys. 2 formulas that we need. And my unit circle, my measurements from here. So let's take a look at this. 2 formulas we're going to use. This is we call the lesson for today is going to be called the sum, because we're going to be adding the sum and difference. We're going to either add or subtract the sum or the difference formulas. For today, I'm just going to use sine and cosine. Notice that's why on the unit circle I only gave you guys the sine and the cosine values. Now, for sine, let me say I'm going to add angles A and B. So if I'm adding the sine angles A and B is going to be sine of A times cosine of B plus cosine of A sine of B. Remember that formula. Now, using sine, if I subtract angle A minus angle B, if I subtract, I'm going to use the formula sine of A times cosine of B minus cosine of A sine of B. Notice how they look pretty similar. The only difference is that when I was adding, I have a plus in between. When I'm subtracting, I had a minus in between. That's for sine. Now for cosine, I'm going to be dealing with what if I'm adding, so the sum we're going to add, or what if I'm subtracting. Okay. So if I'm adding cosine of A plus B, I'm going to use cosine of A times cosine of B minus sine of A sine of B. If I'm subtracting, I have cosine of A times cosine of B plus sine of A sine of B. Hoping this makes sense. These are formulas I'm going to use. If I add in sine, if I add in in sine, if I add on cosine, if I subtract on cosine. So I give you the sum and the difference of each. All right, so let's take a look at our work. Remember your unit circle. Okay, so let's go back to here. For purposes of practicing both adding and subtracting, for purpose of practicing adding and subtracting, for my first two examples, questions 7 and 8, notice for the notes I put sine questions 7 through 10 and cosine questions 11 through 14. So for purpose of practicing both, for question 7 and 8, I'm going to use subtraction. We could do addition or subtraction, but in my case, I'm going to subtract. So let me remind myself the formula for subtraction. Remember I said A minus B. For subtraction, I came in and said the formula for subtraction was sine of A cosine of B minus cosine of A sine of B. Okay. So I'm looking for my angles. Remember your unit circle. Once again, let me refresh you guys of your unit circle. I'm looking at degrees in this case. Try to think of two numbers, two of the degrees that we have, that when you subtract those two numbers, you get 15. It doesn't matter which two you choose. Once again, let me rephrase that. Look for two numbers that when you subtract, you get 15. So looking at my unit circle, I'm going to use 45 and 30. All right, 45 minus 30 is 15. So I'm just going to say, I'm looking at this as sine of 45 minus 30. So you guys see where I get my two measurements. Sine of 45. So I'm just going to do this as sine of 45 times cosine of 30 minus cosine of 45 times sine of 30. 45 is my A and 30 is my B. Remember your unit circle. This is what I mean with unit circle. Remember your unit circle. All right, sine of 45. Sine of 45 is radical 2 over 2. Cosine of 30 is radical 3 over 2. Cosine of 45 is radical 2 over 2. Sine of 30 is 1/2. So I have this as radical 6 over 4 minus radical 2 over 4. Radical 6 over 4, I just multiply these two out. Radical 2 times radical 3. And then for the minus part is there. And then for the other part, I just multiply these out. So I'm just going to say that I have a 4 at the bottom. I have a fraction with a common denominator. So that gives me radical 6 minus radical 2 on the top. This is how I write it. Now, how am I going to type this? Because on the top part of my fraction, I have a minus. Make sure the top part of your fraction, you use a parentheses. So the way you're going to type this will be parentheses radical 6 minus radical 2, close parentheses, that's just the top of my fraction, over 4. I'm not using parentheses for the bottom of the fraction because there's no plus or minus at the bottom. Okay. Now, let's take a look at question number 8. Remember I said I'm practicing subtraction. I came up with the formula for subtraction. You could do addition if you wish, but I'm thinking, all right, two numbers from my unit circle, two numbers that when I subtract them is equal to 255. Let me remember my unit circle. Two numbers that when I subtract them equals 255. How about 300 minus 45? So I'm doing 300 minus 45. That does give me my angle. Once again, I'm trying to do anything that I can here to get to 55. So I'm thinking of this as sine. Which numbers did I say I was going to use? 300 minus 45. So that means 300 is my A, 45 is my B. So I need to do this as sine of A cosine of B minus cosine of A sine of B. I'm just using the formula that I gave you guys. Sine of A, sine of 300, or as a matter of fact, let me replace this with numbers. So I have this as sine of 300 times cosine of 45 minus cosine of 300 times sine of 45. Remember your unit circle. Sine of 300. I'm just using the picture that I showed you guys earlier. I'm using this. Remember my first value. This is my cosine and this is my sine. So sine of 300 is negative radical 3 over 2. Negative radical 3 over 2. Cosine of 45, that's radical 2 over 2. Cosine of 300 is 1/2. Sine of 45 is radical 2 over 2. So when I multiply these, that gives me negative radical 6 over 4 minus, when I multiply these, that gives me radical 2 over 4. I must combine my fraction. I have a over 4 because I have a common denominator. That gives me negative radical 6 minus radical 2. I cannot combine them, so that's my answer. How to type it? I'm going to use parentheses on the top of my fraction because on the top of my fraction I have a plus or minus. So I'm going to go negative radical 6 minus radical 2 all over 4. If you want to continue using the subtraction, the difference of sign, continue using the difference of sign for questions 9 and 10. Now think of two numbers that subtracting, you get 105. There are numbers that if you subtract, you get 105. But for today's purpose, because I want to practice the addition, I'm going to practice here. Let me change this to green. I'm going to practice the addition part. A plus B. So I'm going to think of two numbers that I add this time. I gave you guys the formula. I'm looking at sine of A plus B. So when I write it here, I'm just going to say that sine of A plus B is equal to sine of A times cosine of B plus cosine of A times sine of B. All right, so I'm thinking two numbers, two angles from my unit circle that add up to 105. Let's remember the unit circle. Two numbers from a unit circle that when I add them is equal to 105. I'm going to think 60 plus 45. The order doesn't matter. I'm thinking 60 plus 45. If you're thinking 45 plus 60, it doesn't matter. So I'm thinking 60 plus 45. So sine of 60 plus 45 is equal to sine of 60 cosine of 45 plus cosine of 60 sine of 45. Let's remember a unit circle. All right, so sine of 60, I know the sine of 60 is radical 3 over 2. Cosine of 45 is radical 2 over 2. Cosine of 60 is 1/2. Sine of 45 is radical 2 over 2. Let's multiply out. That gives me radical 6 over 4 plus radical 2 over 4. Good thing is that my fractions have a common denominator. So I have radical 6 plus radical 2 all over 4. How am I going to type this? Let's do this in blue. Because there's a plus sign on the top, I'm going to use a big set of parentheses for the top. And I have radical 6 plus radical 2 all over 4. Now let's do sine of 75. I'm just going to do sine of 45 plus 30. That gives me, according to a formula, that gives me sine of 45 times cosine of 30 plus cosine of 45 times sine of 30. Using my unit circle, sine of 45 is radical 2 over 2. Cosine of 30 is radical 3 over 2. Cosine of 45 is radical 2 over 2. And then sine of 30 is 1/2. I multiply this part first. And gives me radical 6 over 4 plus, I multiply this second, radical 2 over 4. For space purposes, let me write that down here. My fraction is all over 4. And I have radical 6 plus radical 2 all over 4. That's how I write it. Now, for typing purposes, because there's a plus sign on the top, I'm going to use a big parentheses. And I have radical 6 plus radical 2 all over 4. Nice. For space purposes, let me erase everything. You guys can always pause the video, rewind. Let me erase everything. So now let's talk about cosine. And for my space purposes, for us to be able to practice both formulas, let's use for 11 and 12, I'm going to use minus. So I'm thinking 2 degrees Okay, so I'm just going to do cosine. I gave you the formula A minus B. Cosine of A minus B, I said it was going to be cosine of A times cosine of B plus sine of A times sine of B. For questions 11 and 12, I'm going to do the minus part. All right, two numbers, 2 degrees, that when I subtract them equals 285. The degrees I'm choosing is from here. I'm going to do, for 285, let me go 315 minus 30. I'm looking at cosine of 315 minus 30. I'm looking for, once again, from my unit circle, from degrees, two numbers that I can subtract to get 285. And I got 315 minus 30. Remember your unit circle. So I'm thinking, all right, I have to do cosine. According to this, I have to do cosine of 315 times cosine of 30 plus sine of 315 times sine of 30. Okay, cosine of 315, that gives me radical 2 over 2. Cosine of 30 is radical 3 over 2. Sine of 15 is negative radical 2 over 2. Sine of 30 is 1/2. Looking at this part, I have radical 6 over 4. Because of the negative sign, I'm going to write minus. Because of that negative sign, I wrote a minus. Now, when I multiply these out, I get radical 2 over 4. So that gives me radical 6 minus radical 2 all over 4. That way you're going to type this, big set of parentheses, radical 6 minus radical 2 all over 4. Now, what about for question number 12? Two numbers that subtracting equals 195. I'm just going to say cosine. Two numbers that when I subtract equals 195. I'm just going to go 225 minus 30. Remember that the numbers that I choose are from my degrees here. Any two numbers I chose 225 minus 30. Notice how I have both of those angles. All right, so according to my formula, I have to do cosine of A times cosine of B. So cosine of 225 times cosine of 30 plus sine of 225 times sine of 30. All right, using my unit circle, I asked myself, well, what's cosine of 225? Cosine of 225 is negative radical 2 over 2. Cosine of 30 is radical 3 over 2. Sine of 225 is negative radical 2 over 2. Sine of 30 is 1/2. So that gives me negative radical 6 over 4 plus a negative radical 2 over 4. So I'm just going to call that negative radical 6 minus radical 2 all over 4. That way I will type this negative radical 6 minus radical 2 all over 4. That's how you do cosine of A minus B. Now, for us to practice, let me give myself some more room. For us to practice the cosine of A plus B, for questions number 13 and 14, you can still do minus. Think of two numbers that subtract equals the angle given. Like you can still do minus, but I want us to practice the plus. I want us to practice the plus sign, so I'm just going to do let me remind you guys of the plus formula. Remember, I'm looking at cosine of A plus B. Once again, I want us to practice the plus sign. The cosine of A plus B, the formula is cosine of A, cosine of B, minus sine of A, sine of B. All right, so I'm doing the plus sign now. So I'm thinking, all right, two numbers that I'm added equals 75. From the angles that I can choose, I'm gonna choose 45 and 30. So for this example, I'm looking at cosine of 45 plus 30. Two numbers that added equal 75. And once again, the numbers I can choose are my angles from my unit circle. So I have, according to the formula, I have cosine of 45 times cosine of 30 minus let me give myself some room. This thing got erased. All right, let me go back to my formula. So I have minus sine of 45 times sine of 30. Remember your unit circle. Cosine of 45. Cosine of 45 is radical 2 over 2. Cosine of 30 is radical 3 over 2. Minus sine of 45 is radical 2 over 2. Sine of 30 is 1/2. So I have radical 6 over 4 minus radical 2 over 4. So that gives me radical 6 minus radical 2 all over 4. Now, how to type this? A big parenthesis on the top because of the minus sign. So I have radical 6 minus radical 2 over 4. Now let's take a look at number 14. I'm thinking two numbers that when I add equals 105. And once again, I'm choosing my numbers from my unit circle. I'm going to call this cosine of 60 plus 45. According to my formula, I have cosine of 60 times cosine of 45 minus sine of 60 times sine of 45. All right, cosine of 60, remember your unit circle. Cosine of 60 is 1/2. Cosine of 45 is radical 2 over 2. Sine of 60 is radical 3 over 2. Sine of 45 is radical 2 over 2. So I have radical 2 over 4 minus radical 6 over 4, which combines to be radical 2 minus radical 6 all over 4. The way I'm going to type this, big parentheses on top. Radical 2 minus radical 6 all over